Good evening and welcome to the Spotlight Show, part of the Daily Prelude Show here on ALRA TV, where every Tuesday night we have a panel discussion about very hot topics, and also we give the antidote to a series of problems, a series of events that are happening around the world, anti-social events, and we most certainly talk about the antidote to this poison that is developing in the world, and that is Sufism, divine love, love for all, tolerance for all, and the Sufi way of life, the Sufi lifestyle. And tonight on the Spotlight Show, I'm very pleased. I've got two wonderful guests that we're going to be discussing. Last week we discussed the religion, the part of extremism, very much. We concentrate on religions. And tonight, guys, we're going to talk about politics. And I have Faiz AlRiaz on the panel today. And of course, Burhan, who joined us last week. Welcome, guys.
Nice to be here.
Yeah. Guys. And so we're going to talk about politics. In particular, tonight, we're going to talk about the ugly rise in extreme right-wing politics. And namely, the incident that happened last week in Germany, in Hanau, in very, very near Frankfurt. And we were lucky enough to visit there last month. We had a Mind, Body, Soul Expo just outside of Frankfurt in Mannheim. And the Universal Sufi Order was spreading the message of love, tolerance and peace. And obviously, while we were there, somebody was planning something else. Somebody from extreme political views that would lead him to burst into a bar with innocent people in a shisha bar one evening, and shot 11 people dead. They were nearly all, I think they were practically all from different ethnic minorities, Turkish and other backgrounds. So we have seen a big rise in Europe, most certainly in Germany. This is why I was always very keen to spread our message in Germany, because I've been reading over the last months. Actually, it was after that there was an attack, I mean, if you remember last year, in a synagogue.
Yeah.
And that was just by the grace of God that he was unprepared. He was a very amateur guy. He had homemade bombs and a homemade gun as well, and it didn't quite work out for him. He couldn't get into the synagogue, and he went into a kebab shop and he shot somebody. This was last year, and it's been on the rise. And this pattern, which obviously we've seen in Europe many, many times, that develops when a country starts to go into some kind of a decline. Germany, most certainly, financially, they're in a bit of a decline. I mean, employment is very high, unemployment is very high. And of course, you start to get the blame flower out. That's what we used to say in our kitchen when I used to work. When you blame everybody else, you get the blame thrower out. And it's exactly what's been happening, what happened in 1930s, most certainly in Germany, when they went through that ludicrous inflation. I don't know did you learn about that in school? And with the inflation in Germany, they used to walk around with suitcases.
Oh, in Germany?
Yeah, suitcases full of cash.
Post-World War I was a disaster for Germany.
Right.
Because it was a disaster for the Allies as well, because what they essentially did was to sort of make Germany the reparations for the war. So the reparations were extortionate, to the point where basically they completely destroyed and decimated Germany's economy. And the funniest thing is that demand for reparation after World War I almost directly led to World War II, because it kind of gave rise to the sort of movement started by Hitler, that nationalist movement, because Germany didn't want, obviously it was, like you said, it was starving. People were walking around burning.
Situation.
They were burning cash. They were burning cash as a way to keep warm. And it's interesting how that led to that nationalist movement and the amount of death that's caused as well. But the funniest thing is that in Germany today, you see that nationalism sort of rising a little bit.
Yeah.
You've got political right-wing parties like the AfD,
Yeah.
and they're sort of very much against the sort of recent migration of just refugees, basically.
They're the third largest, aren't they, political party in Germany?
They're the third largest political party in Germany, and they've that kind of re-emergence of things, it's just whether it's economics or whether it's just a resentment, xenophobia, nationalism just tends to rear its ugly head.
Yeah, I mean, people are questioning this, even in Germany. Other political parties are fearing this sudden rise in tensions. And I mean, to be honest, like, why do you let political parties legitimize these types of, ideologies in the first place? There should be ground rules set for all political parties, shouldn't there?
Yeah, there's that.
Because once the common public sees that coming from a political party, you're legitimizing it for them. You're giving them courage to go out there.
Yeah, and the whole sort of idea is that, like every country that has a democracy usually ends up with a two-party system, which is kind of it's legitimate. It's not legitimate. It exists. It pretty much is the way, Labour, Conservative, Democrat and Republican. But I guess the critique there is that when one of these major parties appeals to the lowest common denominator, people's fears, when they exploit it in any kind of way, and you'll sometimes you'll see it with Republicans, you will occasionally see it with Conservatives. I wouldn't say the whole party, but you'll sometimes see certain politicians sort of stoke up that fear. Whenever they do that, they kind of almost, in a way, give movement to some of these other parties, whilst people might not support these parties directly, because these major politicians have kind of legitimized it in just a small sense. Then all of a sudden, there are other parties that sort of leech on that and say, well, actually, he's only just mentioned it, but we're going to make our whole platform based around this. And it has, it can have massive negative effects.
Let's talk about it. If we mentioned legitimize a few times. Legitimize. Do you think there's anything you could legitimize in the feeling of people that all of a sudden there's hundreds of thousands, millions actually, with the refugees that came as well from Syria?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, an influx of millions of people from overseas, different cultures, different languages, whatever. And they all come inside the country. Do you think anybody would have some legitimacy to think, what's going on here, to raise the question that...
I suppose they do have the right to question it. I mean, personally, I would feel uncomfortable if someone were to just show up in my neighborhood, and it would create, uncomfortability, because there's just huge influx of people that you don't recognize and you can't relate to. They don't even the same language. There's just so many barriers on a social level, and they intrude your space. And I mean, I suppose in that sense, I do empathize and understand what people can question. But at the same time, how can we give, rise to actions where, you're, inflicting other people? There should be a more strategic way, a more, I would say, humane way to approach it. Well, shouldn't there?
I mean, I'm not
appeal to the government.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to lie. Like the influx of refugees has been tremendous. It has been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But at the same time, if you think about the entire European project, it was designed essentially to give rise to democratic nations that could work cohabitively with each other.
Exactly.
But at the same time, there was also a massive focus on human rights, especially from Germany.
That's true.
If you look at the regime that existed just before World War II with Hitler and the Nazi sort of party, the amount of people's lives that had been subjected to sort of inhumane treatment, cruel deaths. So that was something that spread all across Europe. In Europe there is the European Union, the European Convention on Human Rights, and I feel like on some level it is important to sort of recognize these refugees as being human beings that do need to be located somewhere. It's not it's not just a technical issue that you read about in the newspaper. These people do exist and they do need somewhere to go. And that's one of those things where, I get that it's difficult for a population, like you said, it would be shocking to see, an influx like that. But at the same time, I think there has to be some way to accommodate that. But I think what's really fascinating is how something as simple as, well, I wouldn't say something as simple as that, but something like that can give rise to some of the nationalism that we've already started to see.
That's true. And one of the things I'd like to say is that it seems like, well, the world isn't at a global level prepared for incidents like these to happen. For the example, the Syrian refugees, no one obviously would predict that would happen. So in that case, most countries took, spontaneous initiative. Okay, we'll take these many number of refugees.
Exactly, and that's the biggest thing.
That's a good gesture from you, but at the same time, the people of the country need to understand.
It's necessary, though,
necessary,
isn't it?
But they don't. Obviously, they haven't planned for this.
Yeah.
Maybe they can relocate over time, and I believe they have. There have been many refugees over time. As the country is stabilized with the influx of people coming in, over time they built separate places. They've built many facilities to keep refugees.
Yep.
So it's just about accommodating and giving time for changes. Obviously, at the same time, we can't be on either side, on an extreme level. Neither can be left wing extreme or right wing. So staying in the middle is really important.
It is.
So they really, you could say, lots of them have, in some way, lost their humanity. That somebody who would take it out, firstly, on innocent people, isn't it? He's not. If we talk about this individual last week, he's not gone directly even to the government or anybody who's allowed this to happen. He's just gone after innocent people.
Yeah.
And in an inhumane way, he's killed innocent people in cold blood.
Yeah.
So bringing the humanity side back to it, and obviously he's going to get a lot of support from what he's done from people who are detached, aren't they, from their human values, really?
Yeah.
This is a detachment from human values. Just because of somebody's different race, somebody's different religion, that you would dehumanize that person. And this is obviously very much part of Sufism, is bringing the humanity back, and not only just the love of humanity, it's the love of all creation, and recognizing the godly nature in everybody else, the human nature in everybody else. Now, our Sufi master wonderfully explained, I think it was last week, when he said it, actually everybody becomes a mirror to you. When you have that enlightenment of the heart and that Sufism, everybody is a mirror, a reflection of yourself as a human, and a reflection of the godly attributes.
That's true, yep.
So how on earth could somebody with a gun go into a shisha bar and shoot innocent human beings? It's absolutely...
There's clearly something going on there that's sort of... Is that the result of that alienation from society? That's literally, no matter what type of extremism that you'll find, the one factor that is always key is this alienation. Even when you see those, when you see these groups, when there's that sort of grouping, 10, 20, you'll never, those groups in and of themselves will also be isolated, they will also be alienated. And that kind of only furthers the resentment that they feel towards society. It furthers the resentment that they, it sort of furthers the resentment that they feel towards policy and government as well. And as a result, it can, what can start off as just an innocent gathering of people venting their views in isolation, in alienation, can actually develop into something that sort of gives sort of credence towards militancy and sort of radical change. There's only so much talking that these people can do in that sort of environment. So if you don't, it's some of the issues that they might have, if they were to openly discuss them, if they were to engage with the public, you'll find that, in many of the cases, there'll be people, large groups of people who already agree, who aren't extremists, but they will agree. For example, there'll be people that disagree about the Yemen bombings, the United States and the United Kingdom. People disagree with that. So there is already a platform for those views. But in isolation, in alienation, without the rest of society to kind of balance those views, and this is usually why we'll always see these people sort of just commit these attacks out of nowhere, because they've just stayed away from people for so long. They've stayed away from the rest of society for so long. And eventually you'll just see, instead of being able to have sort of more moderate views, when you have that discussion internally, just back and forth, eventually the idea becomes more
stronger.
It becomes stronger.
Sense, yeah.
It becomes stronger, and eventually the
Your
resentment.
affiliation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Your limited affiliation, and the only amount of human interaction is with the limited amount of people you have that you've isolated yourself with.
Yeah.
So when the only person you know is in front of you, and the whole world is cut off from you, you cannot connect to them. You can't relate with them, and so then there's the lack of, empathy.
But and when you talk about resentment, and you mentioned government, resentment of government, they have got a major role to play as well, especially spokespeople from government and other powerful people. They have to choose their words wisely after these kind of events.
Yes, definitely.
And I think give a balanced statement to whatever the situation. It doesn't matter who has perpetrated the event. It should be balanced. And I always look at who's made comments, who's made statements. Do you?
I always do, yeah.
Pick it out and I think, mate, you didn't say anything about this one and you said this one about... I remember quite clearly things that people say in past, and when people are quiet about certain events, but they're very vocal about other events.
Yeah, that's true.
I do this thing where I tend to want to sort of get the public's opinion on... I want to just sort of see the public's opinion on things. So I'll go on websites that I don't normally sort of look at, like Breitbart, which is a bit of a... It's a pretty far right group. Yeah. Well, not group. It's a far right. There's groups on there, but it's a far right website. But the thing is, I was looking at the comments, the reactions to what was happening in Germany, and it was shocking actually, because in so many of these cases, I feel like when it's an Islamist terrorist attack, and I use the word Islamist, not Islamic, because that is exactly what it is every single time. Islamic would imply that it's religious and that there's nothing political about it. Islamist is an ideology. It's actually an ideology. Mm-hmm. The idea of a very strict, very cruel version of Islam being used as a political system of governance, and basically every attack is done in the name of that, essentially, not in the name of God. In the name of an Islamist movement, basically.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily representing Islam,
exactly,
but it's using
But whenever
it.
you see any of these Islamist attacks, everybody's on the same page. It's disgraceful. It's disgusting. This doesn't represent Islam. This is, and you see it obviously when you look at the right. You can automatically see the opinions that they have there. It builds resentment for them towards Islam.
But true.
Ultimately, everybody, it's the assumption I always had was that it was that resentment was at least built on the foundation of a hatred for terrorism. But when I was reading through the comments on Breitbart, it was disgusting. Some of these people were saying that this was justified because of the EU immigration, that this is to do with Merkel, and the fact that she's enabled this, the fact that this will continually happen unless something is done. And the comments that are being made seem to almost factor into some of these the terrorists' opinions, that the manifesto that he built. And I think that's a lot to do with the same type of alienation, in my personal opinion. Because, when it comes to these Islamist terrorist attacks, most people come out in support of the victims. They come out to sort of propagate that there's a friendliness to Islam. After the Manchester attack, there was a big march done by many of the mosques. Many Muslims always come out in support of that. But a lot of these far-right people don't they don't come out of their shells. Most of them, they'll just sort of sit online and comment on this daily. And then you start to see the same type of effect, which you'll see in extremists as well. The only difference being is that with extremists, there's that kind of that's something that you've seen far down the line. Like event. That's kind of what I find a little bit concerning, because there's no real way to discern whether or not any of these people actually would do that, especially from some of the things that you read online about what they're saying about this attack. Instead of talking about the attacker and how devastating this is, instead people are talking about why multiculturalism is a failure. That it was a shisha bar, and talking about sort of irrelevant things. It just seems, it really worries me. It really worries me when I see things like that.
But what about the politicians, though? I mean, I was looking at most certainly the Chancellor, Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel, I mean, she's always very, very quiet, usually, if it's an Islamist attack. Very, very quick to come out. I quite like to say that she called hatred a poison, which is very much in line with what we're talking about with the antidote to extremism. So we identify it as a poison.
Yes.
Before this event happened, this was about 3 weeks ago, we called it as extremism as a poison. So she has said that hatred is a poison, and she's called racism a poison. But very rarely I've heard her talk about Islamist. She doesn't identify it. It's always just terrorism. And the same with Sadiq Khan. The last attack, I mean, he's the mayor of London.
Yeah.
That's his city. He's nothing to do with Germany. He should have some compassion for Germany, obviously.
No,
he's the mayor of
out.
London. When there's an attack on London, there was 10 killed, wasn't there, on the bridge attack and the market attack. And he's always, terrorism is
Is that the recent London bridge attack? Or
Yes, yeah.
That was, I think there were 2 people that were killed.
Right. And he always says terrorism is
Yeah.
part of living in a big city. That's it.
I mean,
Seriously?
Yeah, that's usually the statement he comes out with. It's just
Wow.
part of living in a
I think
big
So
came
city.
he, just accepted it to.
So I think that adds fuel to the fire as well. They have to
That
be
does.
very careful with their words.
That
They do.
definitely
They
does,
should be
'cause
very balanced. If you're going to name one, this is right-wing, white supremacist, this is racism, this is disgusting, he should do this exactly the same to the other. But they always seem to avoid one or the other.
Yeah.
I think personally it's to do with the fact that politicians are inherently political, obviously, because they all have political views. And for them, there's a difficulty in discussing the political nature of these things because they don't know how to
offend
they don't
certain societies.
because when you spend a lot of time as a politician putting forward your political viewpoint, then all of a sudden discussing why one is better than the other, essentially it becomes difficult to look at terrorism and to be able to actually recognize, well, actually, even though it is political, it's to do with the psychology of why you're so attracted to that and most politicians won't really want to talk about that specifically because that factors into how they get electorates, how they get the electoral votes and stuff like that. But so they won't talk about the fact that actually there's a psychology to why this terrorist was closer to this.
Because we're discussing what the fuel is, aren't we? What's feeding their hatred? What's feeding? Is it they're picking up bits from the media? They're picking up what their politicians are saying, or as you say, and they're going on to these public forums.
Yeah, most of them do. Most of them,
and they're really believing that this is. I mean, but these are what do they call them now? Keyboard warriors. So they
Keyboard warriors.
These aren't
warriors
somebody that
word,
aren't going to say this to you as a face to face.
Yeah,
no,
they're only going to say.
That's actually more worrying. Ironically, because like a lot of people say in response, it's like you wouldn't say this to my face, but it would actually be better if they did, because then they would actually have an outlet.
They would have an outlet. Yeah,
because
that's a
anything
good point.
done in isolation just.
See, and that's what's
feeds into
happening more,
itself.
isn't that building up? That's the problem. Instead of going to actually face the problem, they're just more like just trying to alienate the people even more.
There's avenues that they can take,
So the one problem is that whatever country you go to, people don't have the ability to coexist. Is that if you actually start trying to, mingle and trying to learn each other and trying to remove the barriers, then there's actually some outcome out of it. Then we can actually try and work on a practical level. But if you're not even willing to try and resolve it rather than, just backing off, and obviously that builds up. And I think it was Burgess, I'm not sure of his full name. Yeah, Mike Burgess, he was speaking about the AFD as well. That the problem is that the politicians nowadays, they're not taking responsibilities. When they do speak out live, they're so political in a way, but they're still fueling the fire. They're still giving rise. They let that seed, grow within people's minds rather than cut it off there and then. They should have, they should have a statement that should be acceptable or,
they don't take charge. They don't take charge of.
No, because they're not
events.
holding themselves responsible. And we have perfect example, Donald Trump. He just goes out and he says whatever he feels
The
like.
fact that they don't hold themselves responsible is one thing, but the fact that they don't actually go out of their way to almost take these people in and then to actually sort of say, well, not to normalize some of their viewpoints, but to actually temper them. They don't do that. You don't see these parties taking these people who clearly have these sort of xenophobic views. You don't see them temper it. You don't see them
control that
to redirect them. Instead, they exploit it because again, like I said, this is what politicians do. They it's a natural part of politics. You exploit people's psychology, and that only feeds fuel into the fire. It's why you see politicians sort of scrambling almost to talk about terrorism, and they use the same words every single time. But what they never talk about is how they actually they sort of abuse the psychology of many of the people that believe in these political viewpoints. Instead, you could take that and sort of create an environment that doesn't stoke up that level of vitriol and hatred.
Like, have like some sort of program for the native society, you know, just for them to kind of how would you say, get onto level with, you know, what's happening.
Well, yeah, I mean,
so they can kind of,
for example, like
deal with it.
Instead of, you see a lot of people have views on immigration. Most of those views, if you look at the deep into the electorate, that they're based a little bit in sort of into race, and sort of like just sort of basic sort of racial xenophobic views. To take that and to kind of actually understand that maybe there is a viewpoint to be had about immigration. Again, you know, I don't agree with that personally, but to temper people's sort of views and kind of almost rise them up a little bit above their sort of basest desires. But then instead, you see, you know, like during the Brexit campaign, Nigel Farage posting a massive poster of brown immigrants and talking about a different type of immigration altogether. Most immigration comes from Europe, not from the Middle East. You know, like that kind of appealing to
targeting.
And then obviously when they don't acknowledge that, and then these terrorist attacks happen, it becomes almost difficult. You know, you see the same thing. It's it's a disgrace. This person was evil. Not sort of like, you know, well, actually, there's something that we can all do about this, and, you know, change our political discourse to actually kind of sort of not just stamp out these types of individuals, but to actually bring them towards sort of like the rest of society, away from extremist views.
Yeah, so let's bring on to the individual basis then. That how do you think they are radicalised? How do you think they're joining these groups?
Yeah.
Is it similar to other terrorist groups? Well, I mean, they don't really have. You wouldn't say that they have a single cause. Somebody like ETA in Spain or the IRA. They had a single cause. Well, they had a goal.
Yeah.
But what is their actual goal? Say like Islamist terrorists, the attacker on Manchester, what is the goal? What's driving them? Is there something that they're heading for? And the same with right-wing extremism. Obviously, as you said, I think most people, they're most right-minded people. You don't even have to be right-minded. Most people do agree that there has to be some kind of a level of immigration. People would know that. So I don't think their goal is for completely everybody to go back to their own country, or are they just joining on? Are they just on board?
There's a mix of feelings in that regard, but like this last attack that happened in Germany, was this like? Would you say this was from a group, or was this an individual who had done this? He was
more of a lone wolf. He was part of other groups. He was quite attached with the groups in America as well.
This is actually what's known as hive terrorism. So the difference between, I mean, there was the National Socialist Underground, and that was, you know, a few years ago. That was sort of the big organised right-wing kind of terrorist group. And there are sort of terrorist groups or cells that are right-wing in the UK and across the world as well. But generally...
enough that Combat 18 is banned in Germany, because there's a branch in Germany.
Yeah.
But Combat 18 is not banned in the UK.
It's not banned in the UK, but it is recognised on some level as being a group. Like, for example, if you're trying to join the police and you're part of Combat 18, you won't be able to join, because they kind of do... like, you can be part of any other political party, but you can't be part of that. So there is like a brief recognition that there is something criminal to it.
But
like, to go back to what I was saying before, like, there are these groups that exist, but most of the time, most of these terrorist groups are most of these terrorist attacks are committed by people under what's known as hive terrorism. So they don't have any contact with any type of extremist groups. They don't have that the same sort of progression. Like, you know, most of the time there's the isolation, and then there's the ideological sort of struggle, and then there's the sort of like gathering of people who are like-minded. With this type of terrorism that we're seeing, it's not actually to do with that. It's mostly... It's relatively unknown at the point. It's sort of similar to what you see in America when you see all these mass shootings. It's just isolation, a lot of different conflicting things that the person's experiencing and what they're sort of communicating, you know, on the web, mostly in silence. And then all of a sudden, like there's a bit of a flick of the switch, and they automatically just go ahead and they do this. And it's interesting because it's built off of other terrorist attacks, but they themselves were either built off another terrorist attack or they were done in complete isolation, which is why it comes out of nowhere. like with a lot of the Islamist terrorist attacks, usually, people will be following the different sort of extremist groups in the UK, seeing people who are attracted to that, seeing people within that organize themselves. But with this, it's just somebody saw it online and essentially took a gun and decided they would do the same thing. And it's kind of terrifying because, like I was saying before about that forum that I was reading, like that, any one of those individuals under this kind of sort of like theory, basically, any one of them could be the next one, because that's how hype terrorism works. They have these views, they're already instilled within them. It has been formed out of that sort of the same sort of methods that you would see with other extremists and terrorists, but the difference being is that there's just further isolation, no type of grouping whatsoever, and then like that, something snaps and they end up doing it. And there's actually been a rise in people who have been referred to in Prevent. So there's been 1,300 individuals referred to in Prevent because of right-wing extremist concerns, and that's actually going up from the previous years. Ironically enough, Islamist radicalization has actually been going down in recent years. I'm not sure, there may be different factors that lead into that, but especially when you see, since Barack Obama got into office and since Trump got into office, right-wing extremist, sort of far-right extremist views have actually been going up.
Yeah,
and
it's kind of like tipped the scale. To be honest.
It's the scale's been tipped,
Yeah.
and those views are actually going up, and it's not difficult to see why.
Yeah.
In the sense that
what you said about Islamic terrorism going down, I wouldn't necessarily it's going down.
Well, no, the number of people
yeah.
being referred to Prevent is going down. So
Yeah.
that might be.
But those are just statistics.
It might be misleading because
we're neutralizing the roots, because
Yeah.
the thing is, in all countries now, there's an establishment of sleeper agents. Even in Australia, there's alarming, news showing up now about sleeper agents coming to rise. And to be honest, obviously, there's just so many people on Earth now. There's all sorts of people with different ideologies, so there will be some form of that type of extremist views in every country. But when, I think it's just about tipping the scale, to be honest. People have the ideology, but the will to take action comes when, political situations come arise, and then they have some basis to do it on.
Yeah.
And I mean, then individuals, like the one that happened last in Germany, it's not like it was pre-planned, but people they flip, don't they? So
they do, and when they do, the results are devastating. But the scariest thing is that it's
so how
difficult.
do we get rid of the sleeper agents? Because that's basically where most.
I mean,
of this...
when you say sleeper agents, you're talking about like these when some of these people just flip or switch or.
Okay, I suppose in that case there's two. Well, one's the organizational people.
Yeah.
Like there's Al Qaeda, Taliban. There's sleeper agents all across the world. Ones that we know of and ones that we don't know of. India, Pakistan, Afghanistan. And then there's the things that are happening in Australia and Germany. From both sides, left-wing and right-wing, there are people that are part of an organization and they're just told to lay low unless they have some, initiative taken.
Well,
but for individuals,
when
I
it
would
comes to
say...
the sleeper agents, like that's interesting because that's to do with espionage. So, the idea that somebody comes from a group and comes over to a country to kind of conduct things on behalf of a group or a government.
Yeah.
But, usually that's dealt with by the security services because, there's a predictable element there. People know, for example...
that's far easier to recognize.
In Syria or in Afghanistan, if there's a group of terrorists there, when they communicate in the UK, when they send people to the UK or they send people anywhere, like there's a trail that comes from that.
Yeah.
But the more sort of terrifying thing is the radicalization where somebody that from here that isn't connected to any of that.
Common person, basically.
Yeah, the common person is just attracted to that and sort of brought into that sort of either slowly but surely or very quickly in many of these cases.
We're going to talk about radicalization next week. We'll put radicalization under the spotlight next week. Going back to the Frankfurt incident, we have a report from Germany from our man in Frankfurt, Sheikh Imran Ullah, a prominent member of the Universal Sufi Order, who lives just kilometers away from where the incident happens. And he's going to be giving us an update of what the feeling is there now, because we've kind of like experienced the other side in London many times after these Islamist attacks, how people from Islamic backgrounds are treated the very moments afterwards, up to weeks afterwards, getting onto a bus with a rucksack, people move away and people are looking here and there. They're very dubious of what's going on. So it's just I was very curious to think what happens now on the other side with white people, maybe in ethnic minority areas in Germany. Are they kind of looked on in a bit suspicious way? But they're trying to get back to their lives there. They've had their demonstrations. And I think we've laid the roots there. The Universal Sufi Order have laid the seeds of love in Germany, and we're going to be increasing that over the next couple of months. We're going to be going back to Frankfurt and Hamburg to do our mind, body and soul, because this is the answer. Sufism, love, tolerance. This is the only way we're going to get a harmonious society back. So let's go over to Frankfurt and get an update from Sheikh Imran.
Gorshe Marhaba everyone, Gorshe Marhaba Sayyidi Yunus Al-Gawal, Gorshe Marhaba Brother Steve and the ALRA TV team. I have a quick update for the attack which was taking place last Saturday. Well, after one day we saw all the corners, everywhere was the same topic. People are very disturbed and trying to understand why such thing can happen in our country. And Angela Merkel as well asked this incident that is a poison which poisoned our society. And this poison is to be blamed for this horrible incidents. On last week, Friday, on the Friday prayer, there were more than 2,000 or 3,000 people there. As well, the minister was here. All people came together and speaking with us, with each and everyone. Try to understand this hatred, the extremism which is taking place, and give each other hope. Obviously, the people that lost their family are still very, very depressed. And later on Saturday, we have protest march in Hanau. There was more than 2,000 or 3,000 people as well. Protest against hatred, extremism. And the other side, we have a march with the left wing's extremism and the right wing's extremism. I don't know what's going on. Always we heard the problems was far away, maybe in Italy or Bangladesh or Africa or somewhere else. Now we have the problem in front of our door. And Hanau is only 20 kilometers far away. And then on Sunday, maybe, we hear the same incident in Stuttgart. There was as well in Shisha lounge somewhere, someone and shoot around him. Thank God there was no people in the lounge and no one is injured. And the recent reported incident is yesterday on a carnival march in Volkmarsen, a city called Volkmarsen, about 250 kilometers far away from here. There was someone with his Mercedes and his drive full in the march. So there were a lot of people injured. More than 50 people was injured. 35 people was heavily injured and 12 children as well. So if once an incident happened, I think it motivates all the other hatred souls. They are already maybe not ready because they need an impulse, and they get the impulse from this one guy which last Saturday, and they came up and are motivated to do things like this. And yes, I'm thinking not only about the victims. In my mind came also the people who does these bad things, because before someone do these horrible actions, it take a lot of time to prepare him. So this guy must be in a childhood, and then later on, always bad things, and so what I want to say, it's need a lot of time for someone to do this. It is often easy to say they are hatred souls. It is so, but to whom we can blame this? The society? Obviously, the society helps, the media helps, and everywhere the mind goes from these people. It is very necessary that we find connection to the politician and the whole world. Then we tell them our divine message and try to spread everywhere where we can. And my experiences in the last days and last months, wherever I go and speak to someone who is not involved in spirituality, it is very, very, it's a big problem to make him understand, because he heard this knowledge and it's too much. They are not able to understand this knowledge. So we need a lot of time for these peoples to explain our knowledge so that they can understand. So this was all from my side from Germany. I'm sorry for my English skills. Maybe I did not find always the right words to explain my emotions and my message to everyone. But I know the most of you have understand what I want to say. And I give back to Brother Steve. See you next time. Bye-bye. God Hafiz.
Wonderful. God Hafiz, Brother Imran. Wonderful report there. He touched on lots of beautiful points of this domino effect, and we can discuss that on next week's show. We're going to be putting radicalization under the spotlight, and there's some very interesting topics that we can talk about radicalization. Something that came in the news this week, which was close to my heart, somebody from my hometown, a lady who's converted. Her name's Safia Amira Sheikh, and she converted to a form of Islam that has persuaded her. Her name is Michelle Ramsden. She's a white Christian lady, but somehow she was persuaded to belt herself up with a bomb and go into St. Paul's Cathedral and blow it up. But she got caught by MI5.
Sounds like a shop.
MI5, and luckily, but that is just appalling. So we're going to talk about that, how she was radicalized, what was in it for her. So we're going to put that under the spotlight next Tuesday. That was a beautiful discussion that we had today. We're going to definitely talk about that impulse as well, this impulse to carry out these acts without any kind of thoughts of anybody, any human values, any human connection with no consciousness of what's going on around you. Yeah. You got an impulse to do it and you do it. But when you have the divine love, when you have Sufism, when you have a consciousness of God's presence everywhere, that you're being under the sight of God, how are you going to carry out such atrocities? And it's probably, and not probably, it's definitely too late for some of these individuals like we just saw last week. But as Sheikh Imran said very clearly, that this must have started at childhood. Yeah. So let's get these roots out here, and don't let anybody else come under this poison. And take my head off for Angela Merkel for saying that it's a poison. But Angela Merkel, you didn't say what the remedy is to the poison, what the antidote to the poison is. And that's Sufism. Join us next week on the Spotlight Show. Coming up now is the Daily Pulse with Nasir Yunus. Thank you very much, gentlemen, and we'll see you next week. Good night.